Yes, as Michael said, we really want to just kind of start off with a bit of demystifying and a bit of trying to make some of these complex terms that are often banded around the sector a little bit easier. And I've got the very tough role of helping you understand what impact is. And it's very tough, and we can't just give you a single sort of one sentence definition. But I think what's really important is to think about these kind of three things. So first of all, impact is fundamentally the change that's happened because of an intervention or because of the work your organisations do. It could be across multiple interventions and multiple activities, but it's really understanding like what has changed. If you weren't there, why would the world not be sort of slightly better? Um, it's often quite intangible and quite hard to understand because it is broader and longer term. So it'll be really easy to understand what your outcomes are, or maybe not really easy, but easy enough to understand what your outcomes are. But it might be a little bit tougher to understand how that leads to broader sort of impacts. So we work a lot in kind of employability. So it could be the case that an outcome is getting somebody to attend a course on sort of skills development. The impact might be much further down the line that they end up getting into work or increasing their employability opportunities or whatever that might be, which then in turn would have sort of societal impacts on the local area, so reducing kind of the need for benefits or additional support for these people. So it's really hard to track, but if you think about it early on, you can start understanding what sort of impacts you have and how to maximise them as well. And then the other thing is that it tells a story. So it might not be as heavy on the numbers. Numbers are still good though. Funders do love a good number, but it's also about telling the story around that and about sort of being a bit more narrative focused and really being able to shout about what it is. So people might use kind of storyboards, almost like comic book strips to understand what the impact are, or they might use some other tools as well. But fundamentally, it's just trying to be able to tell quite a clear, tight story about what you do that includes some good data and that really, really highlights what the change has been. And what we've said here is it's really important to think about this as early as possible, whether that's early in an intervention or an activity or early in your organisation's kind of development, because if you know what you're looking for and if you know what's likely to be changing, you can start getting the data that would show that. I often come in as an evaluator, so Michael's there at the beginning doing the grants, I might come in at the end, and if the data is not being collected, we can't report on it, or we have to use proxies, or we've got to find other information, and it gets a bit tricky and messier, and it makes the story a little bit less clear. So it's trying to just get this as clear as you can. I've just put here a little bit of a jargon buster, and again, as Michael says, we can share on the slides, but it's just to think about some of the key kind of terms that you might often see in funding forms when you're kind of going ahead and making these applications. So first of all, you're generally asked what are the inputs, what you're going to be putting into a project or to an organisation, and that's quite simple. It's your resources, so the people, the time, the equipment, any money, whatever you need to mobilise something. We then think about the activities. That's kind of the specific things that you will do day to day. So hi funder, if you give me this amount of money, I can do X, Y, and Z. You might also hear this referred to as process interventions, but fundamentally it's just what are you going to do? The outputs is probably the easiest one to measure. This is where we start getting into the measuring. And that is just measuring kind of the number of activities that you've done. So if you've said, can I have some funding to deliver these courses, and you've delivered 30 courses, that is a clear output. It's also the number of people that have attended the courses or whatever that might be. So it's really, these are quite numerical. You should be monitoring them as you kind of go and have sort of good monitoring forms just so you can be counting the numbers of people. And again, depending on the type of funder, you may be wanting to count people in terms of demographics, so age, gender, ethnicity, and where possible using the census data collection forms, because then that tends to link in better with what funders are expecting. Outcomes and impacts is where we get a little bit trickier. So outcomes are the sort of short and the medium term changes or benefits that we want to see. So again, this might be that people that have attended your course, their confidence has improved. You've done some surveys and they've told you their confidence has improved. And you might also then do some interviews and understand why that's happened and get more background around it. And the impacts of these much more longer term effects or aspirations. So it can be effect on the users. So again, back to the example, that could be getting a job or moving closer towards a job, but it can also be the effects on wider society, your local system, other organisations around you, whatever that might be. So if we can start thinking about what the outcomes could lead to, that's when you can start understanding what sort of data to collect for your impacts. But also this is how you can start telling the story. So we put in this, we did this many people are engaged, and look at what's now happening. And that's where your story is. That's where the real impact is. What's happening after you've done the inputs and the activities. So there's some really important tools you can use to think about impact early on. And one of the kind of most simple and, to be honest, most widely used ones that there is in the UK sort of charity sector at the moment, which you probably have heard of, is called a theory of change. So theory of change, they can look very different. There's thousands of ways you can do them, but fundamentally it goes through these areas. It says, what are your inputs? What are your activities? What will your outputs be? And what are your likely outcomes and impacts? It makes it quite easy to then visualize it because you have it in a bit of a pathway. You've got it in that kind of clear sort of chronological order. You can really start understanding what specific changes lead, so what specific activities lead to the specific outcomes. You can start identifying links between different elements. So if you've got certain impacts, but there's 3 or 4 activities that all lead towards it, you can start kind of categorizing them together. It also, as an organization, helps you test your thinking. So you should do a theory of change at the beginning for an organization as a whole, but also for any individual kind of projects or programs you're running. And then you should go back and review them. So it might be every 6 months, every year, every 2 years, whatever makes most sense for your timelines. But it's really, really, really interesting to go back and go, oh, we thought that would happen and it hasn't. Let's have a think about why. Do we need to tell our funders? But also this new thing has happened and that's exciting. How do we shout about that? And Michael's going to tell you some good ways how you can shout about the good things. And as I say, it's really important to regularly update these to reflect on what's happening. The reason that we use them is that it's very helpful to help you plan and improve interventions. So just being quite structured and quite sort of methodological about what you're doing. Often people have the big impacts, like we want to change the world in this way and we're going to put this in at the beginning, but the middle bit gets a bit fuzzy. Or some people know exactly what's going to happen in the middle bit and know exactly the outcomes and the outputs, but don't think about those kind of broader impacts as well. So it can just really help to sort of structure your thinking. It's also the real big foundation for evaluation, evidence, and funding applications. Funding applications use these terms. I ask you to estimate what things are going to be. And if you've got a sort of standard theory of change to work from, it might make your life a little bit easier. They're also really important to communicate to funders what good has happened. So it can be used at the beginning as you're planning, but then also as something's going on to let them know what the good stuff is. And then also internally, you can use that as a basis for learning. So if some impacts just aren't being hit, no matter what you've tried, maybe you need to rethink what your impacts are. Maybe you need to add in some new activities and new interventions in order to kind of get there instead. So it can really be quite a good tool to help your organisation think quite strategically. I'm going to pass back to Michael.
Right. Thanks, Maddie. Okay, so I think following on there from what Maddie was saying, I mean, there are particular things to do when you're looking at what evidence to provide or how to position your organisation. I think particularly a good starting point is when you're applying for funding is about considering what the fund is actually looking to achieve. Why are they set up? What is their strategy? So there are certain things you can do. There'll be obviously a program prospectus, for example, which will explain a little bit about why the program's set up, how that may fit in within the mission of the organization, and talk about things like priorities and exclusions, etc. So I think, there are some fundamental documents such as a prospectus, such as a strategy, such as, the website of the organization, where you can get a real sense of what they're trying to achieve. Why is the funder set up? So by doing that, you can then sort of understand about what this program is really trying to achieve. What are the purposes of that? What are their priorities? What are their principles even? Are they sort of really focused on lived experience? Is it about community need? Is it about trying to understand about how you can embed this within your sort of experience and design to help co-design and test and learn programs? Trying to understand who are the key stakeholders here? Is it about the funder? Is it about, perhaps sometimes funders get money from central government. So it's actually different stakeholders that can perhaps be involved on looking at how perhaps healthcare, NHS, educational systems form part of that. And like, as I say, it's looking at really, what is the objective here? What is the real impact they're trying to make? And once you understand that, you can then sort of understand, what your role can be and how you can position, your support to fall within that. And again, you can then sort of tailor your response accordingly. And also sort of think about those relational relationships. Do you have the right offer, or is it actually reaching out to other partnerships and trying to strengthen your bid? So there's various things you can consider within that. So next slide, Maddie. Okay. So to explain, with funders, they, who have a range of different teams, really, from having perhaps two or three, sort of people within the organization to having all these different teams. But in effect, when you're providing information, there are certain things that funders will be looking for. And here are probably four key areas that are useful to probably understand. So firstly, the research, when you provide monitoring, when you're providing updates to the funders, it's about how are they using that data. And certainly research is something they would be doing in terms of trying to collate all that information and look about, what does their future strategy look like? How does this information help inform where they go next? How does it help, think about the messaging that they're giving on social media, for example, and maybe even lobbying, and they're sort of talking to other policymakers and other organizations about how to change the system, because I guess the work that we're all doing is because the system doesn't quite work, and how can that help inform the future? So this is what the data will be helping to do. And I think from then you can sort of say, well, this is really the added value we're giving beyond those numbers, and how you can perhaps dig down to what's really happening at a grassroots level sometimes, and to help them to really be informed of what's going on. You then have obviously monitoring that's coming through. So this is really about the updates and the evidencing. So it's about standardizing processes and learning. And as they collect this information, it's about what can they do differently? How can they perhaps streamline some of the processes a bit more? And certainly, through our experience, there's the Institute for, IVAR, the Institute for Voluntary Action Research, who have flexible funder commitments, for example, where there are 8 commitments to help funders to be more proportional, to be more open, transparent, trusting. And that monitoring data really is helping them to probably review themselves against that and how they can improve their processes as a result. That also then comes on to the evaluation piece. The evaluation is about really examining a program and taking more of a deeper dive. So looking at the program, looking at the process level reviews, and some of that evaluation work could therefore sort of have sort of future conversations with you to sort of understand, how did you find the program? What worked, what didn't work? What activities did you run? Trying to get quotes, case studies, and trying to pull together, models really about, what the program's really doing and what the next steps are. And then lastly, coming on to learning is the whole piece around, communities of practice, where it's not just about giving money. Funders are starting to think about having those relational relationships where they can sort of have those conversations with you to understand what's working, what isn't working. And it's not a numbers game, as Maddie sort of mentioned earlier. It's not just about the numbers, it's about evidencing and, what does that look like? So communities of practice can bring people together. It's about having perhaps thematical areas or perhaps geographical areas and trying to have particular focus groups, but where you can actually talk to each other and where you can share learning, where you can share, ideas or challenges you have. And it's not necessarily a funder then having to convene all of this, but you could do it yourselves by having those sort of connections with these other groups that have been funded. And equally, that data then becomes data insights that is used as part of learning, and then what those public facing opportunities look like and how they could inform discussions or change as well. So it's similar probably to research, but it's how organizations can learn and move forward. So these are all things that funders will be looking for. And again, the part you can play in helping them to move that dial a bit from just numbers to having a real storytelling sort of situation. Next slide, Maddie. Okay, so this is more a diagram to sort of explain really the types of evidencing that you'd probably gather as part of your monitoring returns, and the types of I suppose stakeholders, service users, beneficiaries that you may have. So firstly, certainly there's the core of your organization, the people within the organization that obviously will have insights of what's going well, what isn't, but you also have obviously people that are using your services, and you'll be collecting various sort of information from them regarding their, their ages, their demographics, perhaps where they are in their journey. And then you then have indirect support, which should be potentially, it could be like wider family members. So perhaps other people that can benefit as a result of those individuals. You've got family members, you may have wider communities, and perhaps even like professionals. So you could have perhaps healthcare professionals, for example, or others. You then have perhaps lived experience as well. So people that can perhaps inform programs. So it could be people that you're working with in your governance structures, or people that you're bringing in to sort of understand what's working, what isn't working, what could we perhaps offer in terms of our program. So where you're listening to those individuals that have lived experience to inform what you do. Similarly, community leaders play a part. So understanding, who they are, and you'll probably have more of a sense of that than a funder would. But who are those community leaders, and how do they sort of understand what's going on and what should be happening? And then you also then link into things like referral pathways. So as you're starting to receive individuals and perhaps your service isn't the right one, and perhaps they're leaving and going elsewhere, you're working with other services within the system, and whether it's charities, whether it's kind of on to the next one is about these complementary services of others. It's about not saying the system's broken and you ignore it, but trying to add value and really address that. So it's perhaps working with organizations like job centers and DWPs, and we know they're not great, but it's about how they play a part, and then you're really bolting on the trusted sort of safe spaces to to reach that those further people that are struggling, and how you can do that. And then you also have other services which could be public or perhaps employers or others as well. So it's trying to map all those stakeholders that really play a part, and that then strengthens your bid, that you're not just yourself, but you've got all this whole network around you which you can pull on as well. Thank you, Maddie. So the next slide is around really talking about funders and what they're really sort of sort of interested in seeing. So again, it will be informed by their own sort of RML teams when you've got sort of reporting, monitoring, evaluation teams. But certainly, a core thing that they would tend to be asking for is really about the reach of the individuals. So it's trying to understand the depth and breadth of where they're coming from, the types of groups they are, the ethnicity, demographics of ages, ethnicity, etc. But also the types of interventions. When you try to think about a portfolio as a funder, you don't want everyone doing the same thing. It's about trying to test new ideas, look at innovation, look at different intensity models and different types of interventions. So it could be that you're running, I don't know, like a youth services program, and perhaps a funder is then thinking, well, okay, we've got some organizations over here that are doing one-to-one support. You've got some sport activities which are one-to-many. You've got some counselling, some mentoring, and all these different geographical reaches. And that's really what they're looking for, is to try and find a good balanced portfolio that really reaches the I suppose the individuals that will have different needs and different expectations. And then as you come down to sort of outputs and outcomes, it's about, well, what does that really achieve? So, outputs are more the shorter term, sort of benefits, and looking at longer term outcomes as well, and thinking, okay, well, how do the work that you're doing, how does that really help the program and help the funder to move on and, achieve and start ticking those boxes of what they really set up to do? And as we come on to tools, certainly there's a range of different tools, and it shouldn't be a funder prescribing and saying, well, this is what you've got to do, or this is how you do it. It's more, you've got your systems in place, whether it's a case management system, whether it's, there's a few examples here of views, upshots, and perhaps some using 365 still, some using, the Warwick Edinburgh model, skills builder, whatever you're using, it's about not any right or wrong. I mean, you're the experts, and funders are recognizing that. You know best, but it's about how you use that to really understand the distance traveled for those individuals, and how they can really showcase and benefit the difference that this funding is making. It's all about impact. It's all about trying to demonstrate how you are reaching the outcomes that they're seeking, and that's really the part for you to play. And certainly to put in within your bids, and to put within your costing model as well. These things are are not cheap. They do have value to them and cost, and that's something you need to consider as part of your offer. So the next slide, Maddie. So here we're talking about social value. So what is social value and why should you consider it? And some of you probably are fully aware, and others perhaps not so much. And funders, even local authorities, combined authorities, are still working this through. So social value. So what this is the positive impact organisations or individuals have to create for society beyond just the financial metrics. And the Procurement Act, it was 2023, it was revised, but this is about trying to introduce place-based approaches. And what this really means is that when you're bidding for work, whether it's a funder, whether it's a bid for a tender from a local authority or anywhere, it's not anymore. It's not focused around who's the cheapest or what you're providing. It's also including elements of social value now. And that will trickle down because you'll find that some funders will get money from governments and government will be holding people to account about the social values. So it will trickle down. And part of the decision making process will mean that some funders will have to change a little bit and not just focus on the priorities of the program, but also consider a value for social value as well. So what this means is really about starting to consider about like I say, you're sort of thinking about, organisations that you'll have access to contracts. What does that mean? And also when you deliver work, how you evidence those obligations as well. Because if you say you're running a program, there's going to be some local employers you're reaching, or there's an apprentice you're going to bring in who's locally based. They will start trying to look at how you evidence that and show that actually that has happened through, the life cycle of your project. Okay, next slide, Maddie. Thank you. Okay, and the benefit of this. So I've sort of tried to label a few things here to sort of try to explain a bit further about social values. So it's, some of this will fit in within the delivery of your work, but some of it may not. And again, it's just trying to think about how you can perhaps come across a little bit differently or perhaps rethink, what your model is and what your project is. Because if you're thinking about social value, it's then thinking about areas such as these, where we're thinking of inclusive growth, for example, where it's about equitable access to opportunities. So trying to help provide access to opportunities, particularly those from perhaps disadvantaged individuals or communities. And you may be doing volunteering, you may be doing, like I say, apprenticeships for these individuals, but it's again just thinking about those. Environmental sustainability, that's always part of the government agenda about how to reduce environmental impact, how to look at supporting decarbonisation goals. And it's not always in a bid. So I think sometimes it's about thinking about those areas as well and about community well-being. So how you can support stronger, more resilient communities, how you can increase perhaps employment in the local economy as well. Fair employment and skills. So how you look at what good work really is and how you offer fair pay. So it's within, the living wage, for example, whether it's the real living wage, the London living wage, how you account for that and really sort of demonstrate that and talk about the opportunities for people to learn and develop. It's about trying to help people to move on and help those, as we said earlier, those from disadvantaged communities, perhaps. And then lastly, about transparency and accountability. So through all your monitoring, it's about reporting back. It's about, the impact that you're really having against what your social value is. So, for rocket science, we do have obviously our mission, we have our values, but we now have a social value statement as well. And that sort of forms part of our offer. And it enables us to then make sure that because it's quite clear, we can monitor that because we know what we're saying we're going to do. What we don't want are little bits and pieces responding to particular bits where, things will chop and change. And then you've got to perhaps work out how you're going to sort of report things back when it's something different. So I think just having a more of a collective idea of what a social value could look like can be really helpful. Okay. Then we're coming on to social media. I'm not an expert. It used to take me a while to get used to using LinkedIn and having an account, but we use them quite regularly in rocket science, and we've got quite an open sort of a way of working where we do have opinions and we can share those on socials. And I think it's quite useful because funders in particular are moving. It used to be years ago that funders would look on applications, they'll have a live round, they'll look at applications and what comes through, and they'll base decisions on that. Where we are now is that you will have funders, particularly corporates, that will use social media. They don't necessarily have open programs. They give funding, through word of mouth or through, their own relationships that they may have. And particularly when you think of the likes of, the Facebooks and etc., they will use social medias as a matter of course through their work. And, organizations generally, funders will be using them as part of due diligence. We spoke about that a week ago for those that you were, attended. But part of due diligence is sort of looking about, well, how do you really sort of show up to your values? How do you sort of share that on social media? So LinkedIn is normally a key account that everybody would tend to have for business purposes. But as you work with different people, perhaps your beneficiaries are young people, then you'll use the likes of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all sorts of things. So it's about, how do you position yourself? How regularly are you talking? And particularly, as we say here on these 2 points, funders are using that to sort of make decisions now. They're sort of understanding, what are your storytelling sort of articles, what are you sharing with the outside world? But equally, it's sort of talking about your connections, who you are connected to, who are your networks. So they're sort of very sort of important nowadays. Next slide, Maddie, please. So certainly when you consider posting or talking about, yourselves or, your programs or your organization, we sort of categorize really 3 key things to consider. So you've got concise, consistent, and engaging. Concise really is about getting to the point. Sometimes there'd be a tendency to write articles and, blogs and lots of pages of text, which I historically have probably had a tendency to do. But this is more about getting to the point. So it's about being sharp to the point, and you're trying to get people's attention very quickly. So it's about, what is the point, what is the evidence, and what's the explanation, or what's your call to action? And trying to use really sort of basic, sort of plain English and short sentences is certainly going to attract, the audience, and also enable them to read, what it is that you're trying to post and convey with them. Consistency as well. So as we talk about consistency, this is about regular posting. You don't do it for the sake of it. If you've got nothing to post, don't post. But you're trying to find a regular way of posting, using hashtags, which also will sort of link into other things as well on socials. And obviously you can various organizations or people as well to try and get them to reshare your work and your posts, which will then reach other networks. So it's about reaching out into this sort of more ripple effect to other organizations and other people. And engaging. So you make it engaging by putting visuals within, the text. It's about sometimes people use emojis still. It's about being yourself, and what do you expect of your audience? What do you expect them to do as a result? So are you trying to inform them of something? Are you trying to inspire them, or are you trying to invite them to something? So just trying to really think about that and ensuring that you can get across your point in a very short, sort of sharp way, really, but that's quite concise and straightforward. Next slide, please, Maddie. Okay. So for those of you that do use LinkedIn, these are just some examples of how you could perhaps phrase a post or a blog. First of all, we talk about the hook, and the hook is about how you draw people in. So it's about your positioning statement. Is it a question that you want to put out there? Is it more about a thematical thing that's happening? Is it something which you can perhaps make topical or thought provoking, which will raise their attention of drawing into what you're still saying? To then think about the context. So the context then is about what your work is about. Why is it important to you? And also about your organization and the outside world, maybe. So it's about what is it you're trying to really sort of tell, that story. And then the insight about what did you do, what did you learn, what did you discover? So what was that sort of learning? And then to close is about what do you expect next? So what are you going to do next? And also what action do you want others to take? Do you want them to sort of join you? Do you want to have like a coffee with them? Do you want to have a meeting? Do you want them to sign up to some event? Or is it just about perhaps connecting with you on LinkedIn for further sort of thoughts and conversations. Um, so we'd certainly suggest that you write as if you were talking to a colleague or someone going out for a coffee. So trying to keep on that very plain English sort of sort of space again, and to try and have sort of gaps between the text. So normally on LinkedIn, you'd have probably about 3 lines, 1 to 3 lines, and then you'd have a sort of new paragraph, because you want to sort of keep people's attention and interest. And, by having those gaps and that sort of white sort of space in between, it does keep their sort of appetite. I think when you sort of go in and you can see pages and pages of text, you read a few lines and you'll probably move on. So I think it's just about how you can try and make it as appealing as possible. And certainly about adding, as we said before, the collaborators, the partners, the hashtags, particular themes you might be using or keywords, because then you're reaching new audiences, you're reaching new people that, that are outside of your network, to be honest. Okay, and next slide, Maddie. Okay, and then I thought it'd be quite useful just to think about what your unique selling point is. I think sometimes supporting funders, you get so many applications come in, and it's so tough at the moment. It is really tough, and you've got charities that will have cost of living crisis. You're seeing more people coming in for services. The funding's getting tighter. It's really difficult, and we see a lot of good applications, and unfortunately, the funding doesn't go as far as supporting everything. You get a set budget and you can only support so many organizations. So it's really difficult and to sometimes let organizations down that they probably just haven't made that final cut. And there are a lot of organizations that perhaps might have similar interventions, perhaps reaching similar audiences, different similar people, perhaps working in the same sort of boroughs perhaps, or areas. So the USP is quite important. So I think it's sort of saying to yourselves about what is it that makes you different. A funder said to me, it's about what is your magic sauce, is what they called it, and it was about what makes you different. So why do you stand out from the crowd? Why are you standing out from a competitor? Why should a funder be supporting you? And it's not just saying, well, we're doing all these we're delivering this work. It's about, well, what's it, perhaps additionality on top of that. Funders want to learn, they want to sort of understand what's going on. They want to sort of be connected to other groups, and particularly those that are connected on social media, to raise their programs and raise their organization. So it's about what else you can bring to the table, really, to help beyond delivering a project. So if we go on to the next slide, Maddie, I think there's some examples I'll try to sort of map out. Yeah, so basically it's about, what could make you different. So you could be, perhaps it's a particular type of intervention which not many people are doing. It could be that, the intensity of the support you're giving is quite different to, your competitors. It could be, the reach, that you're reaching a lot more people than perhaps someone else is. And, with the value for money, maybe that's your thing. But it's trying to understand, what is it? Is it about safe space and a trusted community? Is it about you have a really good level of retention? Is it about those individuals? You're reaching a particular group that no one else is reaching, or you're filling perhaps a specific gap which the funders perhaps are struggling with. It's really trying to understand, what does that look like, and even SROI, social return on investment. That perhaps you are looking at that, and you can say, well, actually, if we've worked it out, if you give us a pound, every pound invested means that it's £4 worth of perhaps benefit to the society. So there are certain things you could think about that make you different from someone else, and particularly for the funder, what's in it for them. They've got to sort of understand that perhaps you're reaching perhaps it's additional insights that you're able to give them, which they're needing, or perhaps some sort of brand association, or perhaps it's about reaching, as we said, like a gap or a network that they're not really mapped into, but by working with you they gain access to that network. So there's quite a lot of different things to think about here, and particularly there are funders where it's going beyond the money and starting to think about capacity building and funder plus models, which have been around for years, but it's about going beyond the money to really invest in the charities to be more sustainable and resilient. And if you're funding that sort of program, then you want charities that are on board, that want to develop and take on board that capacity building, but equally you may have particular training or something that really stands out you're really good at, which you can share with others. So it doesn't need to be the funder perhaps doing that, but as a community of practice, it could be that you can say, well, actually, we, I don't know, really good at perhaps IT or something. You can say, well, we can talk. We just had a session on AI. We can talk to others about that. That's like additionality, which will benefit the funder and other charities.